Hello everyone, this is going to be a YouTube video about the AP Microeconomics topic of income inequality. To chunk together several of the models that we've developed throughout this course, and to show you how you can apply these models sort of as analytic tools to help us think about trade-offs or a story related to this topic, right? Income inequality. Okay, so let's get into it. First model, and the most logical model to start off with, was the Lorenz curve, right? So we can see right here, a Lorenz curve, we said, helps us graphically represent income and to compare income inequalities across society. And our baseline that we can sort of start off with is the line of perfect equality, which you can see right here is this 45-degree line through the It's written with my magic pen, but we can see that this makes sense that would be a line representing a perfectly equal income distribution, because if we come down to the x-axis where we have cumulative percentage, the cumulative percent of, we can tell a story where you can have, let's say, is this reasonable to say this is about 5%? This 5% has, and we go all the way up to the line of perfect equality, 5% of the income we can go perhaps 50%, and we would expect them to have 50%. Ooh, that's probably more than 50%. Yeah, it's more than 50%. Ooh, I don't want to use my pen. Right, we can have 50%. We can show that they have approximately 50% of the income distribution of society, so on and so forth. I'll use a darker color and a that makes a little bit more sense. Okay. Obviously, in society, right? So here we can see that 5% of the population owns, what is that, less than 1% of the wealth. As we go on, we can see, this is 1% of the population owns about 5% of the wealth, and we can, conceptualize income inequality with this curve, right? The further away the Lorenz curve is from the line of perfect equality, of course, Gini coefficients, which is a statistic that we can develop from this graphical representation. I just want to say that obviously we can tell compare income inequality across societies, which is what a lot of economists and a lot of news publications do. You'll see talk about Lorenz curves, or more specifically Gini coefficients, which are calculated using Lorenz curves in news publications or in sort of all sorts of academic spaces. However, there are some stories that the Lorenz curve can't tell us, right? It can't tell us how easy it is to move up the income ladder within a society, right? Which is something that we probably care about. It doesn't allow us to think about disparity between societies where society may be, quite poor but have a very equal distribution, right? A lot of people are quite poor, perhaps, compared to a very unequal society that is quite rich, right? The Lorenz curve doesn't allow us to sort of compare that disparity, or doesn't tell that story, I should say. But it does talk about, or tell the story of income inequality within a society, right? Okay, so from the Lorenz curve, we can calculate what is called, oh my gosh, it's like I stopped using the magic pen and I suddenly can't write with the magic pen. What the heck is going on? Okay, it can allow us to calculate what is called a Gini coefficient. And so a Gini coefficient is a statistic that we develop from Lorenz curves and it's the ratio between area A and A plus B. All right, so area A is everything above the Lorenz curve and beneath the line of perfect equality, and A plus B is obviously this right triangle area right here. And then from this, the closest we get to 0, the more, or 0 represents completely equal income distribution, and I'll talk about why in a second. And then 1 represents a completely unequal income distribution, and I'll of course talk about why in a second, right? So 0 represents a completely equal distribution, and so we can think about why for a moment. Well, if we're in a perfectly equal society, then the Lorenz curve is essentially the line of perfect equality, and there's no area underneath the line of perfect equality in the Lorenz curve, so 0 divided by A plus B is just 0, right? So 0 represents a completely equal distribution, and the closer the Gini coefficient is to 0, the more equal the income distribution is in that society. And then finally, 1 represents a scenario in which nobody has income except the very, very last person has all of the wealth, right? And we can see that that's a scenario in which A, the area beneath the line of perfect equality and above the Lorenz curve, is essentially the same as the area of A plus B, right? The Lorenz curve is just this right triangle right here. And so anything divided by itself is just 1. And so 1 represents a completely unequal income distribution, which is what we get here. Or not what we get here, but what we would get in the case of one person owning all the wealth. Right? And so perhaps we can think about policies, right, to address income inequality. One policy is taxation. We've talked about progressive and regressive income taxes in AP government. I'm not going to get into the nuances, or perhaps think about maybe the effects of income taxation or heftier income taxes on specific labor markets, maybe like high income earners or middle income earners or low income earners. So I'm going to have a very rudimentary analysis here, and then possibly discuss ways or things that you need to think about to develop a more sophisticated analysis, or perhaps do further research in economics to sort of develop your views about the logic or trade-offs associated with income tax policies, right? Or, perhaps taxing the wealthiest among us, which is usually where the debate begins. Right, so in this labor market, and I'm again not going to specify what type of labor market exists here. Get a different color. So in this labor market, we have a downward sloping demand curve. Remember, the demanders of labor and labor markets or input markets are producers or firms, and the suppliers are workers. All right, so we have a downward sloping demand curve and a supply curve. And then the way that we can think of a tax, right, sort of using the model that we developed in Unit 2, doing is we're increasing the opportunity cost of working, right? And that opportunity cost is usually, we think of it as selling your labor, right? Because you're no longer able to keep more of the income that you generate with your labor, right? A portion of it goes to the government, right? So we can see right here, this diagram right here split the revenue from, and we can see tax incidence, right? It's not just workers that are going to bear the burden of the tax. Demanders of labor firms are going to internalize some of that burden, right? Because we talk bears the burden of the tax. Statutory burdens or legal burdens are not what determines who bears the burden of the tax. We can see that we generate deadweight loss, right? Anytime there's government intervention and we're assuming we lose efficiency. Perhaps we're okay with this efficiency loss, determining or depending on where this tax revenue goes to distribute the surplus in society. So perhaps we're okay with this weight loss, but nonetheless, we should expect weight loss. And that's one way we can think of sort of the trade-offs to income taxation. Supply curve, a gap in the price that sellers receive. So I'm going to put price in the price buyers pay effectively is instituted. This gap reflects that there is less of the right. This gap is called the tax wedge. Right, and then we can see sort of where would be all of this, right, that I'm going to highlight in red for some reason. Well, I really stopped learning how to use the magic pen. Maybe I'll highlight another color. Yellow, this represents the new is all of this green. When before, producer surplus used to be all of this red plus this area right here. But now, taxation, we distort incentives, right? And then you can see the revenue that comes from buyers and the revenue from sellers. And this, right, we're sort of raising the opportunity costs of working, right? And people are going to start substituting work for leisure. Now, the interesting thing about labor market specifically too is that there are two effects that are in play in labor markets: the substitution effect and the income effect. And we said we see these effects in output markets as well, except in output markets they work in tandem, but in labor markets they seem to work against each other, right? So installing a tax on labor effectively increases the opportunity cost of continuing to work, and people are going to substitute work for leisure. However, that substitution effect perhaps explains the upward sloping supply curve of labor. However, there's the income effect that we have to consider as well, which is, remember, the income effect is this idea that as you buy, or that as your income increases, you buy more of a normal good, right? And so a normal good for a lot of people that don't like work is leisure, right? Not working, right? So as their incomes rise, right, as the wage increases, perhaps a lot of workers hit a level where they feel content and they want to, like, maybe go on a vacation or maybe work less or work less overtime and stuff like that. So in labor markets, we expect at some range an upward sloping supply curve and then perhaps even a backwards bending supply curve as workers start hitting, perhaps their ideal income bracket, right? So that's one thing to think about, and think about how that probably impacts your analysis or your thinking around income taxation. Also think about elasticities, right? The sensitivity of the demand for labor or the supply of labor to changes in price effectively, right, through the taxation, right? How would that affect consumer and producer surplus? What are the implications of that effect? So on and so forth. How does that impact how you think about the logic of these policies, right? All that sort of stuff. Let me highlight for you one more time. This, why do I always pick dumb colors? This right here is the new producer surplus right after the tax. This up here, this blue area, is the new consumer surplus after the tax. And then this black area is the deadweight loss, right? We disturbed the balance of the market, right? May 4th just passed by us. And this purple area right here represents government revenue. Now, I will also talk about like consumer and producer surplus are imperfect measures of social welfare. I've talked about this in other videos before, but I want to talk generally about this, right? And let's think about consumer and producer surplus for a moment. So one way that we think about social welfare is this this idea that, or actually, no, I don't want to talk about this here because I don't want to make this video longer than it needs to be. So we'll talk about that in another video. Okay, so let's think about corporate taxation for a moment, which is perhaps related to income inequality. I should make this review topic video about income and wealth inequality. And so we've talked about in class before the speech that Janet Yellen recently gave, where Yellen called for a global minimum corporate tax rate. So this is the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. She is, you know, an accomplished economist that is now Biden's Treasury Secretary. She used to be chief of the economic advisors in the Clinton administration, and then was the Federal Reserve Chair under the Obama administration. And then her husband is an academic economist at Georgetown University who has a Nobel Prize in economics. But she called for a minimum global corporate tax rate. And it was interesting news because it came on the heels of a report that there were several companies, including FedEx and Nike, that were incredibly profitable, but due to the US tax code, they actually paid 0 federal income taxes, or 0 federal corporate or federal taxes. So you can see the headline there. And so one of the ways in which Yellen kind of talked about, and I perhaps should go to the article, for some of us, this seems kind of outrageous that corporations are able to kind of skirt any tax obligations, and sort of the development that we've seen with increasing globalization is corporations, particularly multinational corporations, incorporating in areas in which there are lower corporate tax rates, right? And so what this has caused is sort of this rush to the bottom, right? That some people have, critics have said that that are kind of upset about this development have called this a global rush to the bottom. And so we can see in Yellen's speech from this New York Times report, she says competitiveness is about more than US headquartered companies fare against other companies in global merger and acquisition bids. It is about making sure that governments have stable tax systems that raise sufficient revenue to invest in essential public goods and respond to crises, and that all citizens fairly share the burden of financing government. Right, so that's an interesting statement, right? So there are several advocates in the United States that argue for lowering the corporate tax rate in the United States to sort of increase U.S. competitiveness and hopefully get corporations to want to incorporate in the United States, right? And create jobs and all those types of things. But I think it's also helpful to use a tool to think about how this development of, you know, low corporate tax rates throughout the world actually came, or how we can use game theory, right? A tool that we developed in Unit 4 to think about this rush to the bottom, so to speak, of lowering corporate tax rate around the world, right? And we can use the simple 2x2 game. Don't have to get very sophisticated in our tools, and this can represent country A and country B. Right, so let's think about why are corporate tax rates falling and seem to continue to fall and fall and fall. Right, so country A, we can look at the incentive or the payoffs. And so these payoffs, I didn't put them in utils or in dollar benefits. I instead ranked them, each box, or the ranking reflects the ranking system that the countries ascribe to the outcome, right? So remember, the column player is the second number, and the row player, the payoffs are the first number, right? And so the way that we solve games is we look for dominant strategies, right? That's one of the solution concepts that we developed. And so let's hold country B, and let's look for country A's best response if country B decides to tax. Well, country A's best response if country B decides to tax is to lower their tax, right? So we can circle the payoff, right? Reflected in lowering their tax. And the sort of logic behind this is perhaps, right, they want to attract more companies to incorporate in their country and to bring jobs into their country. And country B perhaps can maybe get some of the benefits of maybe taxation, but they're going to lose a lot of companies, and more businesses are going to incorporate in the lower tax country, right? So maybe the lower tax country, after all, gets perhaps more taxation because more businesses are generating more economic activity, and maybe they'll gain more revenue that way, right? And then we can see country A, right? Or then let's think about what would be country A's best response. If country B decides to lower their tax, it would also be to lower their tax rate too, right? Because they don't want to be the one that doesn't lower their tax rate and loses all this economic activity. So we can see country A has a dominant strategy. And so we should be able to solve the game just with one player having a dominant strategy, because we expect the other player just to play the best response to the other player's dominant strategy. But let's see if country B has a dominant strategy. So again, we would hold country A's strategies, or we would look for the best response of country B to both of the strategies of tax and lower the tax. And so country B's best response, if country A decides to tax, is to lower their tax rate to attract more economic activity. And country B's best response, if country A decides to if country A decides to lower their tax. This one wouldn't actually be a prisoner's dilemma. I messed up. My bad. Oh, wait, no. I think I'm fine. Let me double check. Country B's best response. If country A does, oh no, I'm right. Sorry. Is also to lower their tax, right? If country A decides to lower their tax, what is country B's best response? Well, 3 is better than 4, so it's to also lower their tax. And then we can see right here, we arrive at a solution to the game. And this solution also happens to be a Nash equilibrium. That's a situation in which each player is playing the best response to the other player's strategy, and there's hashtag no regrets, right? Country A, for instance, doesn't regret lowering their tax because country B lowered their tax, and if they had decided to raise their tax, they would be in the 4th best position, right? So this is a very rudimentary tool, right? A very rudimentary tool that we can use to sort of think about this race to the bottom of corporate tax rates around the world. But it's helpful nonetheless, right? We can see that we arrive in a suboptimal position, which is the story of prisoner's dilemmas, probably the 3rd best position, that it's probably better if both countries just taxed, right? But there's always going to be this incentive to deviate, right? Reflecting this inherent instability if both countries had this higher tax rate. And then we can imagine if there were obviously close to 200 countries in the world trying to attract more businesses to incorporate in their countries. This would be a very unstable outcome, right? There would always be this incentive to deviate from one player to the next to try to get more and more businesses to incorporate in their country. All right, so Yellen is arguing for a global minimum corporate tax rate. So perhaps prisoners' dilemmas can be solved through institutions or through changing the payoff matrix. And so perhaps an institutional regime to sort of solve this prisoner's dilemma of seemingly or this race to the bottom around the world for the sort of lowest corporate tax rate to attract more economic investment and activity. But I also want to talk a little bit about why Yellen says taxes are good, right? She talks about competitiveness as being more than just attracting economic incorporation or economic activity and incorporation into one country's society. She also talks and appeals towards this idea of generating taxes so countries can provide public goods, right? So she specifically, she kind of defines competitiveness. She says competitiveness is about making sure the governments respond to crises, right? So as someone that has heard Janet Yellen talk multiple times in person, she's visited Georgetown, and I've heard her at the Brookings Institution. She does sound, she has a very logical way, like a very meticulous type, economist. Or I don't know if meticulous is the right word, but anyways, so she does have. She does use a lot of technical economic language in her speeches, is what I should say. And so she used public goods. And so this brings us to, this isn't a tool, so to speak, but we need to know the difference between public and private goods. And this is not a game theoretic tool. We're not around what a public good is, right? And so we said public goods are that this side of the spectrum, goods that are not excludable, where you can't stop someone from using to the areas in which governments can act in such a way as to either provide more public goods or either in the case of public goods, they're underproduced by private markets, or to regulate to stop overuse, right, which happens in the case of common resources. Right, so public goods are goods that are you can't enjoying the benefits of a public good, and they're rivalrous, or they're not rivalrous, meaning one person's consumption doesn't diminish another person's ability to use it. So examples of public good might be national. We expect to be private markets because they're not excludable. You can't stop someone from using or enjoying the benefits of public defense, right? And so therefore private actors really have a hard time extracting, profit from it, so they're not going to produce public goods, right? In order to do public goods, and these goods are, it seems she's suggesting, are going to have spillover effects, positive spillover effects in the economy in general, right? And the way that we can think about externalities. Remember, that's a situation in which the costs or benefits of an action are not just internalized by the parties involved, but spill over to other people as well. So here's an underproduce whatever this is. So we can think of this as sort of national defense, right? And so providing and provisioning or investing in public goods or creating public goods, invest in public goods like potentially national defense or clean air. We can use this model of externality to see why markets underproduce public goods.